If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be greatly appreciated if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating. This helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is your host, Andrew Pledger, and I am really excited about today's episode because I will be digging into the impact of indoctrination and really understanding indoctrination and what it is, what it looks like, the effects of that on a person, on their psychology, on their social interactions, their mental health, and other areas, and also breaking away from that. This is a Patreon bonus episode, and my Patreon supporters allow me to do this work, and I am so thankful for you all because it takes a lot of hours of time of recording and then editing, researching, and in addition to all that for the podcast, I've also been working on a project where I'm tracking different Bob Jones organizations. I found 150 plus organizations so far. So it's something I'm trying to do and make sure that every survivor's story is told, whoever wants and desires to come forward. So there's a lot of work and effort that I put into it. I release 2 bonus episodes of this podcast a month that are exclusive only to Patreon supporters. And in addition to other benefits, every paid membership gets access to my bonus episodes starting at $3 a month. And so at $3 a month, you can get access to this bonus episodes and other ones. You get early access to episodes at least 1 month in advance before it comes out publicly. And then there's also uncovered BJU files. You can get access to 150 plus uncovered BJU files to be exact. And also, a part of every tier is just generally supporting my work, and I greatly appreciate it. It allows me to do this work. But today I want to get into this Patreon bonus episode of the impact of indoctrination. So, what is indoctrination? And this is something that I'm covering in an episode in the future with Rachel Bernstein, and she really does a great job with it. We talk about education and indoctrination. But in this episode, I really want to cover the psychological part of it and the impact on the person and understanding it and the effects. And so I decided to take really this general description and definition from Dr. Yanya Lalich's book, Take Back Your Life, which is an amazing book for recovering from a cult or an abusive relationship. And she talks about indoctrination in her Take Back Your Life book, and she says in the book, and I quote, "I prefer the terms indoctrination and thought reform, which Lipton first used to describe deliberate changes in thought outcomes observed in his study of coercive practices on prisoners of war during the Korean War and at revolutionary universities in communist China. At times, I may also use coercive persuasion, a term introduced by social psychologists. Most often, the outcome is a worldview shift or the adoption of a new belief system and the thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes that go along with it. These worldview shifts are usually manifested in profound personality changes that occur as a consequence of a deliberate program of influence and behavioral control, that is, indoctrination. Often, the effects of such a deep-seated conversion are disturbingly apparent to family and friends who are not part of the cult. After making a commitment to a cult or cultic relationship, people tend to withdraw from those previous lives, embrace new beliefs and values, and sometimes behave in a manner quite different from, if not exactly the opposite of their lifelong patterns." End quote. And what I want to note here is, for people like me and other people listening too who were born into cults or high control groups, like there was no before. We're born into it, that's all we know, and it was purposeful that we were indoctrinated from such a young age to not let us get that chance to develop our own authentic self and be independent people. But that is her incredible definition, I think, an overview of indoctrination. And she does explain it specifically in a cultic context. But for me, indoctrination, I see it the same way as the word cult, as existing on a spectrum. So indoctrination happens outside of a cult also. So just because a leader is trying to indoctrinate people doesn't necessarily make it a cult. You have to examine all the specific dynamics, but when you look to a group that's using indoctrination, most of the time it usually ends up being a cult, even if it starts not as intense, but it will usually get to that point. Whenever there's control involved, it always gets worse and worse. So something I want to dig into next is really different kinds of tools that are used to analyze indoctrination in environments. So I've covered this a little bit in the Surviving BGU podcast. I'm going to do a bit overview. So there's Lifton's criteria for thought reform, which covers 8 psychological themes of totalist groups or cults, and that usually implement indoctrination or thought reform. So thought reform and indoctrination are interchangeable terms. In Dr. Lodge's book, she also says that people switch out brainwashing and indoctrination. She does not prefer the term brainwashing because how it's been misused so much by cult apologists, so people who defend cults. So she prefers resocialization or indoctrination. She definitely believes brainwashing is a thing, but she just doesn't like to use it because of the confusion around it. With Lifton's 8 criteria for thought reform, it's really looking at an environment and analyzing if these 8 psychological themes are happening for thought reform. So the very first one is Milieu control, which is control of information and communication. And this also includes internal self-communication. So controlling how you interpret your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And with the information and communication, just like access to internet, phone calls, watching what you're doing on the internet, monitoring that, not allowed to read certain information, read certain books, watch certain things, listen to certain music, etc. The second thing is mystical manipulation, which is the claim of an authority of being special, divine, or enlightened or chosen by God. And then events in the group are manipulated to seem spontaneous and to really make the group or experience seem legit and to shut down the questioning of the group's legitimacy. I don't know. In my mind, I think of them like putting on a show, like a circus of, oh, this is happening, this is happening. And I'm sure like mystical manipulation is also common in a lot of Pentecostal type groups. But the third one is demand for purity. So this is really like you're expected to follow impossible standards perfectly. And there's usually a snitching system that makes sure everyone conforms perfectly. And when you don't follow perfectly, it results in extreme shame and guilt and self-criticism. So you feel good when you're perfect, which is impossible. So you're just constantly trying to be perfect, to follow these impossible demands, to conform to the group, conform what they want. And you're scared about people monitoring you. And so you are just exhausted trying to be the perfect group member. And now the fourth one is cult of confession, which is really confessing secrets or sins. And really in the group, you're expected to have no boundaries and share everything, which will usually be used to control and to manipulate you. And the fifth one is sacred science. So this is really just the group's claim of absolute truth, and this truth cannot be questioned because it is the truth. So number 6 is from Dr. Lodge's book. She talks about how the language is internal to the group, or it's just jargon that only insiders understand. And this special language or jargon is meant to control or constrict the person's capacity for thinking and feeling and the use of imagination. So usually the language, when I look back on my time in fundamentalism, I think of just how black and white it was. And this goes into information control of how we didn't have the language to explain what we were feeling and experiencing. So me being gay, I didn't have the language to understand that until I finally did. And if you control language, you control information, you can control someone's reality. And the 7th one is doctrine of a person. And this is really denial of self and any other perception other than the group's. Your experiences or reality are altered to fit the doctrine of the group. So if something in the teachings or behaviors of the group are hurting you, then it's your fault or just your reaction. It's on you. The teachings or doctrines will always be put above personal experiences and the well-being of members. And number 8 is dispensing of existence. So this is where the us versus them mentality come in, really towards outsiders. So outsiders are evil. They cannot be trusted. They do not matter. Outsiders are really dehumanized. You cannot trust anyone outside the belief system or the group or with a different political ideology, etc. This is from Dr. Lodge's book, Take Back Your Life, and she is going over Lipton's criteria for thought reform. Now, next in her book, she goes into conditions that are successful for thought reform or indoctrination, and this list is by Margaret Singer. Thank you for listening to this Patreon bonus preview of this episode of Beyond BJU. You can access the full episode on my Patreon. The link is in the description. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.